we are convening here to talk about one story, and that is the bombshell report. And I think bombshell is an appropriate word in this context. From Pablo Torre, from Meadowlark Media, his podcast, Pablo Finds Out, has been very, very good when it comes to investigative journalism over the last few months. They've investigated the Bill Belichick-Jordan Hudson relationship. They've investigated the NFLPA and some improprieties that existed there. And Pablo has moved on to the Los Angeles Clippers and their relationship contractually with Kawhi Leonard. So I'm just going to give the broad strokes. I encourage people to go watch the podcast on YouTube, listen to it on your podcast feed. It's tremendous listen, very detailed, and obviously took a lot of reporting from Pablo to put all this together. But what the reporting reveals, or at least accuses the Clippers of, is an attempt to circumvent the salary cap by lining up what amounted to a no-show endorsement job for Kawhi Leonard that paid him about $7 million per year over a 4-year term. This company is called Aspiration, which is a climate-related company, plants trees to offset carbon footprints. In 2022, they reportedly signed Kawhi to a 4-year, $32 million deal. And basically what Pablo is saying is that the Clippers, through Steve Ballmer, who made a big investment in this company, helped facilitate this in order to pay Kawhi more money and circumvent the salary cap. And look, the anecdotal evidence supporting this, the circumstantial evidence, is pretty compelling. You know, in 2021, Leonard signed a team-friendly 4-year deal that allowed the Clippers to do some things, sign some guys with their contracts. That same year, 2020 and 2021, Ballmer invested $50 million in Aspiration, this company that signed Leonard to this deal. A year later, that's when Leonard signed his deal with Aspiration for $28 million. It was a endorsement/marketing deal, but there are no records of Kawhi Leonard doing any endorsing or marketing for this company. No appearances, no autograph signings, no ball signings, no social media activity. By all accounts, he did nothing to earn the money that Aspiration was paying him. It was, by any definition, a no-show job that earned him $7 million per year. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty of all this. We'll unpack a lot of it, but just your reaction to seeing this story, reading it, watching it, unpacking it. What were your big takeaways from it?
Well, first of all, I think the stuff that Pablo does in general on that podcast and just in the world media-wise is really impressive. So the fact that this is all coming from a source that, as you pointed out, has done a lot of really good investigative work in the past is notable, right? I mean, it's not TMZ reporting all of this. I think that listening to the podcast, there are some things that felt a little bit like leaps, and then there are some things that felt really damning. I think that sponsors of a team doing a side deal with the star of the team is outrageously common in the NBA. That happens all the time. Major stars in major markets. We remember the hilarious HEB grocery store commercials with Tim Duncan, right? And David Robinson and those guys, because they were the major sponsor of the Spurs. So this has been going on for decades. So that part just in and of itself isn't a smoking gun. I don't know how many of those kinds of sponsors the team owner has invested in. I'm curious. That could be possibly something that the NBA is going to look at. The idea that he didn't end up fulfilling any part of the contract is either a smoking gun because they were paying him $7 million, which is a lot of money for any of these arrangements. It's a lot of money for a shoe deal. It's a lot of money in general. The amount is certainly eye-opening, especially considering he didn't do anything. That being said, there is definitely plenty of evidence out there of other contracts between stars and sponsors where they don't fulfill large portions of what's there. They just aren't asked to do it. No one's enforcing whether they do it. Now, has that ever been where it's all portions of the contract, not just a few? I don't know. Again, that's one thing the NBA can kind of investigate to level set where we are on this. When I get to the testimony of the person from inside the finance department that Pablo had on the show, and he had the person anonymously, but obviously seemed to know what he was talking about. That to me is much more damning than any paper trail, because I do think that when you look at all the papers that Pablo found, which certainly led him to this story, they can paint a picture. But Mark Cuban went on the internet yesterday and sort of broke down how each part of that paper trail is also possibly completely innocent or something that's part of the NBA business structure. That doesn't mean, by the way, it was completely innocent. I'm just saying that there seemed to be some ways that if you were just going by the paper in court, you could probably say, hey, you can't prove this. And it doesn't have to be beyond a reasonable doubt when it comes to the NBA. That's not their standard, but there's probably a pretty high standard if you were going to take draft picks away or fine the richest owner in your business. So I think the paper trail is one thing. To me, what stood out, though, was the interview with the employee. And this is a company that went bankrupt. I'm sure didn't pay the people who worked for them at the end, because that is exactly how this works. So you have a bunch of potentially disgruntled aspiration company employees out there who can give you, if this is what actually happened, a blow by blow of the conversations they had. And that to me is where, this could really unravel for the Clippers, if that exists, if those people do. And, I just want to be careful. We don't know for sure. There is going to be an investigation, and I want to be a little bit careful about jumping to every conclusion.
Yeah, the NBA is going to launch its investigation. It's Mike Bass put that out on Wednesday. The Clippers, for the record, have issued multiple denials and say there is provable evidence that these accusations are provably false. That was their word. Provably was the word that they put out in the initial statement. I do think there are some even in absence of a paper trail, there's a lot of reasons to believe in the veracity of these claims. And I think it starts with the broader context of Kawhi Leonard and what people around him have been looking for over the years.
Yes.
And this goes back to 2019, the free agency of Kawhi Leonard, one of the most sought-after free agents in a long time. Coming off that championship in Toronto, finals MVP, there was a thirst for Kawhi Leonard amongst multiple teams. The Raptors, of course, to bring him back, and both the LA teams that recruited him hard. At the time, it was widely reported and investigated that Kawhi's uncle and longtime representative, Dennis Robertson, he's someone I've dealt with in the past when I've been writing profiles about Kawhi. He is Kawhi's guy. He is, not his technical agent, but he operates in largely the same way. It was reported initially by The Athletic that he was out there asking for impermissible benefits, asking for things, Rachel, exactly like this, guaranteed endorsement money. Now, the NBA investigated at the time. They came up with nothing. They came up with no evidence. The Clippers agreed to any of this. This was back, of course, in 2019, but this is something that happened. We are aware that Kawhi was looking for the money in a situation like this. And something you brought up, like there definitely are a lot of players that aligned themselves with team sponsors. I, of course, remember those ridiculous commercials that the Spurs all did back in the day with HEB. They were pretty funny.
They're very funny.
But I think the point there is they did commercials.
Yes,
they did
100%.
something. To our knowledge, Kawhi has done nothing. And the question I would ask if I was ever to speak to somebody in power at Aspiration is, why would you pay this guy $7 million per year to do nothing? Now, yes, we know that Aspiration had an alignment with the LA Clippers. They were a founding sponsor of the Clippers. They were the co-founder was sitting next to Steve Ballmer at the Intuit Dome talking about Aspiration and what it meant and what it was all about for the Clippers to be associated with this brand. But as you're hemorrhaging money, and this is a bankrupt company, that's why this whole thing came to light, bankruptcy filings. As you're hemorrhaging money, you're still paying out $7 million per year to a guy that did nothing for you, nothing whatsoever. Some of the other guys they paid, whether it was Robert Downey Jr., Leonardo DiCaprio, all the names that were on that list that's out there, they did something. Robert Downey Jr. cut an actual commercial for aspiration. Kawhi Leonard did nothing. And to me, it's not a paper trail, but that's a pretty damn smoking gun, Rachel, that they have Kawhi Leonard on their books for $7 million per year to do absolutely nothing. That would be, if I'm the NBA, and look, they'll do their own thing. They're probably going to hire an outside law firm for all this. That's what they do in these types of situations. But if I'm the NBA, I'm trying to get a hold of these co-founders of Aspiration. I'm trying to get a hold of higher ups in that company to at least ask the question of why you're willing to pay a guy to do absolutely nothing.
This is why I think it's the former employees who may end up being the key to this case as opposed to the paperwork, because the paperwork is undoubtedly suspicious. There's no getting around that. But does it create an actual chain of proof that something untoward happened? I don't know, because we haven't been privy to all of it. And as Pablo pointed out on his podcast, there's thousands of pages of documents and things like that. However, there is a difference between the hearsay of maybe one witness and a collection of people from this organization saying, oh, this is what happened. And if you have a collection of people from the organization all telling the same story, that this was a no-show job to give Kawhi Leonard improper benefits, then whatever's in the paper trail is supporting evidence, but it all comes together to create sort of what the case against the Clippers and Steve Ballmer would be. I think it's interesting that there's a little dance with this investigation now, because as I noted, a lot of teams have their big star get sponsorship deals from their sponsors, right? And opening that door, and you have Steve Ballmer, who has unlimited resources, to say, great, I'm going to subpoena every team's records of every sponsorship deal they've done and every deal that those companies have done with the players and how much the players actually did to fulfill those sponsorship obligations. I think that there's going to be a lot of fellow owners that will say, no.
Well, I want to get to that. I want to get to that. That's on my list of things to ask you about, the fallout potentially from all
this. But I mean, even in the investigation phase,
in the investigation, yeah.
Fallout.
Yeah,
right? Because those fellow owners, I mean, the thing that I always try to remind people, and obviously, Chris, you know this well, is that Adam Silver works for the owners. The owners own the NBA. Adam Silver is their employee. So whatever decisions the league makes has to be with the backing of the owners of the company. And this is where it could get potentially sticky.
Well, I agree. You referenced Mark Cuban and the support that he threw behind Steve Ballmer. Said, I'm Team Ballmer. And in his tweet, he really pointed the finger at the Aspiration guys, which I think is fair, but he also criticized Pablo's reporting, which was not fair at all. Look, it's my understanding that Cuban, I saw his tweet before we started recording, like he went on Pablo's show for 3 hours, he said, and talked. So I'm anxious to see what came out of that conversation. But Cuban, in this context, to me, is not credible, because Cuban potentially has a lot to lose if this thing blows up, right? Like, not only could it put a spotlight on all the sponsorship deals that players have received, like, wouldn't you, and look, I'm not saying anything happened there, but has any player signed a more team-friendly deal in the history of basketball than Dirk Nowitzki did, years ago? Like,
well,
go ahead.
There's been sort of rumblings of this with the Miami Heat, right?
Yes.
And again, I don't want to cast aspersions because I don't have any evidence. So I want to make that clear. But there have been teams that sort of specialize in somehow convincing their players to take team-friendly deals. And in the Miami Heat's case, some of it's very sort of out in the open. Those players then draw a salary from the Heat after they retire for positions in the organization. And by the way, that's all, quote, legal to do. It's not as if they are breaking a rule that exists, but there have been accusations from other teams saying, okay, but we all know the intent is that you're promising money later, that you're going to sort of be guaranteed to give them, afterwards. So therefore the contract is basically, it's almost a loan from the players that they'll get this money back later. There's a lot of different ways the teams sort of try to bend the rules here a little bit. And your point about Dirk is exactly right.
Yeah. So when Cuban is out there backing Ballmer, to me, that is potentially as much about self-preservation as it is believing that, Ballmer didn't do anything. The other argument Cuban made is that Ballmer and the Clippers aren't that stupid. I hate that argument. I hate it. I come from a family, Rachel, of law enforcement officials, cops, state troopers, people in federal investigative roles. And one thing I've heard from them over the years is that law enforcement is smart, but you could never underestimate how dumb criminals are. And how people get caught is because they do something dumb or don't anticipate something happening, like a potential bankruptcy of a company like Aspiration. You always have to factor in the stupidity of criminals. I mean, how many people who get caught doing something expected to get caught, who thought they were going to get caught? The answer is zero. 0.0% of people that get caught doing something wrong expected to get caught. So that doesn't jibe with me either. The question I was going to ask you is about kind of what the NBA needs to rule that this was a cap circumvention case. Like, I've seen a lot out there. There's been some water carrying I've found in the last 24 hours that there's got to be a paper trail. There's got to be hard evidence that directly ties Steve Ballmer and the Clippers to this money that Kawhi Leonard was getting. I get the sense, Rachel, that some people out there that aren't going to believe this unless they see a signed check from Steve Ballmer to Aspiration with the memo line for Kawhi Leonard. Like, I really get the sense that some people only buy that if that's the case. Do you think the NBA is going to need that direct line, like an email from Steve Ballmer say, hey, that $50 million, thanks for taking care of my Kawhi problem, or a check written direct, with specifically mentioning what this is for? Do you think they're going to need that kind of paper trail to adjudicate that this was a case of cap circumvention?
Well, look, I do think that if you get a collective number of enough employees, again, if you have 40 people, let's say, telling you all the same thing, that this was what happened without them having really any incentive to do so because the company's gone and, they're just out living their lives in the world, I think that feeds into whatever case the NBA has, even if there isn't a check that says, for Kawhi Leonard, thank you for helping me with my problem. That being said, this case, if they do penalize the Clippers, has got to be airtight because you have the richest owner in the NBA. And by the way, I don't know where he is today because these values change. He's the 5th or 6th richest person in the world. Like, this is an amount of money that, frankly, most of us can't even quite picture because a billion's just what's next after a million. But the difference between a million and a billion is so vast. It's just mind-blowing. He has so much money. He has almost $200 billion. And there is absolutely no way, we know how maniacal Steve is about this ownership of this team, that he is going to watch draft picks and fines and sort of the name of the team stained. If he's not actually caught doing something, there will be lawsuits. And then, wow, what a look is that for the NBA, that a guy with unlimited resources is suing the league because of a ruling they made that possibly could be poked holes in it. So while I don't think there needs to be a check that says, here's money and here's it for Kawhi, I do think that this is going to have to be an investigation, unlike where there isn't someone looking over their shoulder. The NBA investigates things all the time, and often there isn't anyone looking over their shoulder and they can just do what they think. But in this case, there is going to be a lot of lawyers involved. And I think that is going to add an extra element of a burden of proof, because it's got to not only be something that they could reasonably assume from their own investigation, which is, by the way, how a lot of companies investigate, right? This is what we reasonably can figure out from talking to people, in the situation. They're going to have it be legally provable. And I think that's sort of the layer here that's interesting and part of it. And again, get into a lawsuit, discovery exists, and the threat of discovery for all of these other teams having to open up their books to the extent that the discovery will allow for is something that I wonder if the other 29 owners are going to be down for. And they have to be down for it because Adam Silver works for them.
And this is where I think Adam Silver is going to be tested. I agree with you. This needs to be an exhaustive investigation. Like Adam Silver is speaking at the Board of Governors meeting, I think it is in New York next week. I do not expect any kind of resolution then. This needs to be a months-long investigation that is taken out of the hands of the NBA. An outside law firm needs to do this investigation, perhaps in parallel with whatever investigation the federal government is doing right now when it comes to aspiration. But it needs to be exhaustive, to say the least. I think, though, if it comes back that the things that Pablo reported on are what happened here, that there was cap circumvention, this is going to be a big test for Adam, because if there's one thing NBA teams know not to screw with, it's the salary cap. And this was made clear to them back in 2019. Like, there was a warning shot fired to owners like, hey, a lot of things we'll tolerate. We'll slap you on the wrist, some of this dumb tampering stuff when you're calling guys like a few weeks before. But when it comes to cap circumvention, we take this extremely seriously. And they take it more serious now, Rachel, than they did 6 years ago when this investigation to Kawhi initially first began. Because since then, they've got a brand new collective bargaining agreement where they have finally, after a decade plus, achieved what they set out to achieve. They achieved the kind of salary cap structure that allows for unprecedented parity to exist in the NBA. They have taken the free spenders and they have leveled the playing field. Look, the Clippers were one of the teams that were a primary target of the NBA when they were putting together this system. They did not want the likes of Steve Ballmer, of Joe Lacob, of James Dolan, I'm sure of others, to be able to spend their way to success in the NBA. You had to do it in a smart and professional way. If it's discovered, and again, it's a big if here, but if it's discovered that they circumvented the cap, I don't think that Silver is going to have any choice but to administer the kind of punishment that David Stern administered 25 years ago to the Minnesota Timberwolves in Joe Smith. If people remember that story, the Timberwolves, which was, looking back on it, incredibly clumsy. The Timberwolves signed Joe Smith to a series of one-year deals in order to get his bird rights so that they could then give him an $86 million contract, give him the bag that he was looking for. This was a player that in 1995 was the number one overall pick. So in 1999, 4 years later, he's starting to sign one-year contracts. Didn't really make any sense at the time, but because of, ironically, another lawsuit, it was revealed that the Timberwolves' plan here was ultimately revealed. When it was, the NBA fined the Timberwolves a pile of money. They suspended owner Glenn Taylor for a year. They de facto suspended Kevin McHale for a year, took a leave of absence, same thing. And they stripped the team of 5 first-round draft picks. Now, one of them was later restored, but at the time, a penalty of 5 first-round draft picks. They also voided the contract of Joe Smith, who had to go play elsewhere in that season. So what that would look like now would be the equivalent of the death penalty. Like, the Clippers already don't control a lot of their draft capital the next couple of years. They're still paying out these deals to Oklahoma City. But if Adam Silver is going to use that as the standard for punishment for cap circumvention, then this is a basketball death penalty that he could potentially levy on the LA Clippers.
I mean, that's sort of why the stakes are so high, right? If you back, 30 years ago, you're talking about 5 picks. And yes, I think 1 or maybe even 2 of them came back. I don't remember. But that level of sort of disruption to the team ecosystem, especially for a team that, as you note, doesn't have a lot of its draft picks And so we're talking further and further into the future that the penalty would have to occur. And we have much stricter salary cap. And we, in essence, have a hard cap at this point. You know, the second apron is, for all intents and purposes, a hard cap. And so since that exists, those harsher salary cap penalties exist, since the particular team situation involves already, you know, not having a bunch of their first round picks. So therefore, if you're going to take away, quote, their first round picks, not the one Oklahoma City already owns the rights to, then you'd have to go, you know, it could be 8 or 9 years in the future you're going out to. So that's why the stakes are so high. That is why this investigation has to be every T crossed, every I dotted, because you're right. If Adam Silver and the investigating firm come back with inarguable proof, I think the other owners are going to have to get in line behind that. But if there is any doubt, if there is any sort of, well, here's our case, and therefore this is what we think, I think there's going to be a little bit of not resistance or reluctance, but a lot of conversations about, okay, if we go do this, if we move forward, what does that mean? And these are extremely shrewd businessmen and women who are running the teams that, you know, own the NBA, for all, you know, the best way to say it. And that Adam Silver is a lawyer. I mean, everybody involved is extremely smart and knows all of the ramifications involved. And by the way, on the Clippers side, again, Steve Ballmer has unlimited resources. So I am sure there's an excellent law firm that is already representing him in this matter and helped draft that statement. And to say that there's provable evidence was really fascinating to me on that side of things, because it's very hard to disprove a negative, right? So it's very difficult to prove that something didn't happen. That is a particularly hard thing to prove because, I don't know, what you didn't wake up this morning and go rob a bank, Chris, or I don't know, that's a little too extreme. Did you go for a run this morning?
I did the elliptical this morning.
All right. So if I was going to charge you and say, man, Chris, you went for a run this morning, and you're like, I didn't go for a run. It's hard to prove that you didn't walk outside your apartment for even a 5-minute period and run around the block, because how would you be able to prove that, right? And so therefore, saying that you have proof that something didn't happen means that they must have something.
Did you find it, let me ask you this, did you find it notable at all that that sentence or phrase was not in the second statement? I thought that was interesting. They put out a longer statement that did not use the word, or was it provably wrong or provably false, whatever it was in the first one. I thought that was interesting. And it kind of leads me to the last question I was going to ask you, which is, do you think the Clippers have to prove that this is all BS? Like, the second statement they put out basically said that Steve Ballmer believed in these guys and he was kind of hoodwinked by some scammers, and, you know, they haven't been around the team for a couple of years, you know, because they're all their financial troubles. Is that enough? Like, or do you think the Clippers owe more of an explanation?
Well, I think they're going to have to answer some pretty pointed questions from the investigators. I'm not sure they are going to provide more in the court of public opinion, but I'm sure that they will be required to cooperate, to answer as part of an NBA investigation. I'm sure there's language in the ownership contracts that say if the NBA is investigating, you have to cooperate. That is a pretty standard thing for subsidiaries of businesses. So I think they will have to answer a lot more questions. They just might not do it in front of us.
I also find, like, this was like the ultimate just sort of hiding in plain sight, like, to put together a contract with KL2 Aspiration as the LLC name. This was not a well thought out plan or a well thought out scheme.
The argument either way, like, you know, obviously you can do either direction on that. Either, as you point out and your relatives point out, people do really dumb things sometimes when they shouldn't be, and they're trying to, quote, keep a crime secret or whatever it is you call that. Or also, you could say, and I'm not saying this is what happened, but you could say, of course they named it that. They had nothing to hide. Everything here was above board. If they had named it something else, that would have been suspicious, but they put their names right on it. Kawhi signed the contract. It's not even like a trustee who signed the contract. And we did that because there was nothing, you know, there was nothing wrong with what we were doing. So of course we just put everything out there. I'm not saying either version is correct. I'm just saying that treating that as a smoking gun is potentially something that someone from the other side could flip and say, no, of course he did all of that. Of course he put his name on it. There was nothing, no one did anything wrong here.
But why would he do nothing? Like literally nothing. Like even like
I'm not
this would be.
I'm not defending anyone in this situation.
I know, I get it, but this would not. If he just did one HEB like commercial for aspiration, just one, or if he had posted about them 3 times a year, it's not like on paper this is a pretty good cause. Like reducing carbon footprint's a real thing. Climatologists will say that's great. Like to not do anything and to have it written in the contract that you have to do these things unless you don't want to, basically, unless your belief system or whatever you believe doesn't line up with all that. There's just so much like smoke around all this, and to not do one single thing will be the ultimate question. Like, how does someone at the highest levels associated with aspiration justify hemorrhaging money for so many years and still pay out Kawhi Leonard and not ask him to do anything?
By the way, they could have, again, this kind of comes down to either they were colossally stupid or they felt that this wasn't anything wrong, in that they didn't even need Kawhi to participate. That if you listen to the language that Pablo on the podcast and some of the people with him read out loud, they could have just slapped an image of Kawhi from a game or from something else on an advertisement for them, and Kawhi still wouldn't have had to quote show, but that would have fulfilled part of the contract. So again, either colossally stupid or this was a case of, hey, clearly this company was into collecting celebrities, right? And you and I on the courtside seats of basketball games have certainly run into people who just want to prove how many people they know and how many people they can, quote, be in business with. And I'm a business partner of Leonardo DiCaprio. And I would be curious if in collecting these celebrities, what each of them was paid. Is it commensurate with Kawhi Leonard, or is Kawhi's salary, quote unquote, number so much more astronomical?
According to the podcast, the testimony from that employee was that it was more than all of the celebrities combined.
Yes. But I'm curious, again, that's all paperwork that you can find out on paperwork. So I'm curious what the paperwork says about that. And I'm curious if there is anyone else besides Kawhi who, quote, didn't show for their job, meaning that the company did not enforce the contract, because that will also possibly be evidence in the favor of the Clippers if that's the case. If it's not the case, then it's evidence in favor of those accusing the Clippers of wrongdoing. There's just a lot of things that are still, the door is open, and an investigation should be able to show which direction it went. So it's stuff like that that is provable, right? How much did they pay everyone else? What did everybody else do? That kind of stuff is part of the paper trail, whether there's a signed check from Steve Ballmer or not. But it does sort of still be all circumstantial until you have enough people in the company saying this is what happened. And again, in a bankrupt company, there just isn't a lot of incentive for former employees to lie on behalf of the company that doesn't exist anymore and that probably didn't pay them their final salaries. So I think there will be a lot of willing witnesses. It's just what they say we don't know yet.
Hey, and look, the argument that Kawhi doesn't do stuff like this for endorsers doesn't have legs, because you see him in New Balance commercials. You see him putting stuff out there about New Balance, wearing New Balance gear. Like, that's front and center for Kawhi. This one, I think, it needs some explaining. That's for sure. I think we haven't heard the end of this story at all. Rachel, good stuff. I will see you this weekend in the Hall of Fame festivities in the Northeast, where it's a lovely 68 degrees in Boston today. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that kind of weather.
See you soon.